come in the wold had dressed itself for celebration with the particular care that only an English village can muster when it sets its collective mind to creating perfection. The annual midsummer festival had transformed the village green into something that might have stepped from a watercolour painting. Paper lanterns swayed gently from the ancient oak's branches, their soft light competing with the last golden rays of sunset, while the scent of honeysuckle and fresh-baked scones created an invisible embrace around the gathering. Miss Edith Pembroke, former headmistress of the village school and current observer of all things human, sat contentedly on a wooden chair beneath the chestnut tree, her teacup balanced precisely on her gloved hand. At 73, she possessed the particular gift of appearing utterly harmless while missing absolutely nothing. Her grey hair was pinned with military precision, her sensible shoes were polished to a gentle gleam, and her pale blue eyes held the sort of kindness that made people want to confess their secrets, a tendency she had learned to encourage with the slightest of smiles. The evening had progressed with clockwork perfection until now, as midnight approached, and the ceremonial beacon awaited lighting. Around her, the village had arranged itself into its familiar patterns of social interaction, each person playing their accustomed role in the grand theatre of community life. Near the refreshment table, Mrs. Cora Fenn of the Hare and Willow pub wrestled with a stubborn cider tap, her usually immaculate apron bearing suspicious stains that suggested the evening had not gone entirely according to plan. A curious detail caught Miss Pembroke's attention, a scrap of blue ribbon protruding from Mrs. Fenn's pocket, quite out of keeping with her practical brown dress and entirely too festive for someone who professed to find such celebrations a lot of unnecessary fuss. Tom Alder, the village handyman, moved through the crowd with his characteristic efficiency, collecting empty plates and folding chairs with the resigned air of a man who had long ago accepted that tidying up after others was his particular burden in life. Miss Pembroke noted that his coat sleeve had been recently mended, the thread a shade lighter than the original fabric, the sort of careful repair that spoke of pride despite limited means. The evening's most prominent figure was undoubtedly Giles Weatherby, the village solicitor, whose recent marriage had surprised those who thought him permanently wedded to his law books. He was a tall, spare man who wore his spectacles like badges of intellectual authority and who had developed an unfortunate tendency to deliver impromptu speeches about tradition and community values. His wife Lydia, resplendent in a blue dress that made her appear like an exotic flower in a cottage garden, stood beside him with the patient expression of someone listening to a familiar tune played, once too often. Miss Pembroke observed that Lydia's attention kept drifting to the church clock and that her left glove was missing, a small detail that might mean nothing or might mean everything, depending on circumstances yet to unfold. More intriguingly, the right glove bore a smear of what appeared to be blue wax along the cuff, precisely matching the shade of her dress. "Midnight approaches," announced Reverend Arthur Lytton, with the satisfaction of a man whose careful planning was about to bear fruit. "Has anyone seen my blessed taper? Sarah, you haven't moved it again, have you?" His sister Sarah, a woman of formidable organization and equally formidable opinions, rolled her eyes with practiced exasperation. "It's exactly where you left it, on the hymn book shelf, despite your solemn promise to put it somewhere sensible." The gentle banter that followed was interrupted by the discovery of two village boys behind the shrubbery, clutching contraband sparklers and wearing expressions of guilt so pronounced they might have been carrying placards announcing their transgression. The brief drama of their discovery, scolding, and inevitable pardon provided entertainment for the gathered adults, who remembered their own childhood adventures with varying degrees of nostalgia and horror. As the church clock struck midnight, Reverend Lytton approached the beacon with ceremonial gravity. The iron basket, filled with oil-soaked rags and carefully arranged kindling, waited atop its ancient stone plinth, like an altar prepared for sacrifice. When the flame touched the prepared materials, there was a moment of hesitation, as if the fire were considering its duty, before it suddenly whooshed to life with dramatic enthusiasm. The crowd pressed closer, faces illuminated in the dancing light, and for a moment all was simple pleasure, the primal satisfaction of fire and community, of light pushed back against darkness, of human beings gathered together in celebration of something larger than themselves. It was Lydia Weatherby who first noticed something amiss. She made a small, sharp sound, like a wine glass being tapped with a knife, and her plate slipped from nerveless fingers, scattering strawberry tart across the grass in a pattern that would later seem prophetic in its resemblance to scattered blood. Following her horrified gaze, the crowd turned as one toward the beacon's base, where Giles Weatherby lay crumpled in an attitude of terrible finality. One hand was outstretched, palm upward, bearing a light dusting of ash as if he had tried to catch falling stars. His other hand was closed tightly around something, and his carefully polished spectacles lay beside him, their lenses reflecting nothing. Dr. Beatrice Vale, who had been preparing to leave early and now cursed her procrastination, pushed through the crowd with professional authority. Her examination was brief but thorough, and when she looked up, her expression carried the weight of absolute certainty. "He's gone," she announced, and the words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, touching each person present with its cold finality. Miss Pembroke rose slowly from her chair, using the careful movements that people attributed to age, but which were sometimes a useful disguise for intense observation. She approached near enough to see what others might miss. The scorched cuff of Giles's jacket, burned in a precise crescent that spoke of deliberate contact rather than accident, the sprig of crushed lavender in his closed hand, its oil dark against his palm, and nearby a folded programme bearing the evening's schedule, and, on its reverse, hastily scrawled words in an unfamiliar hand, 11:55. Behind the willow. The time was underlined twice. The location was not underlined at all. As Constable Edwin Park arrived with his notebook and his carefully cultivated air of official competence, Miss Pembroke stepped back into the shadows, her mind already beginning to weave together the threads of observation into patterns that others might not see for days to come. She had learned, over many years of watching human nature reveal itself in moments of crisis, that murder was rarely as simple as it appeared, and that the most important clues were often the ones that seemed least significant to everyone else. The beacon continued to burn, its light now seeming less like celebration and more like a funeral pyre, while the village of Ashcombe in the Wold began its reluctant transformation from a place where nothing ever happened into a place where something terrible had happened indeed. Morning came to Ashcombe in the Wold with deceptive gentleness, as if the village hoped to pretend the previous night had been merely a disturbing dream. Mist lifted from the green in pale ribbons, revealing flattened grass where the crowd had stood, the iron beacon with its cold ashes and scattered paper lanterns that had somehow survived, their festive colours drained by unforgiving daylight. By 8 o'clock, the entire village hummed with the particular energy that follows tragedy. Urgent conversations that transform ordinary citizens into amateur detectives, every casual observation suddenly weighted with significance. Miss Pembroke tied her scarf against the morning chill and made her unhurried way toward the village shop, her walking stick tapping a gentle rhythm on the cobblestones. She had learned that the most reliable intelligence came not from official sources, but from the early morning gathering at Mrs. Hobbs's establishment, where the purchase of bread provided convenient cover for the exchange of theories, suspicions, and carefully embellished facts. The shop bell announced her arrival into what could only be described as a symposium of speculation. Mrs. Hobbs presided behind her counter like a benevolent magistrate, dispensing groceries and opinions with equal authority, while her customers arranged themselves, according to the informal hierarchy that governed such gatherings, those with the most dramatic theories commanding positions nearest the warmth of the ancient radiator. "Mark my words," declared Mrs. Cora Fenn, adjusting the blue ribbon in her hair with nervous fingers. It wasn't his heart that killed poor Mr. Weatherby. Hearts don't arrange secret meetings behind willow trees. Her voice carried the satisfaction of someone privy to official secrets. "Constable Park was at my pub past 1 o'clock, wanting coffee. Said there was writing on the programme, 11:55 behind the willow clear as day." Tom Alder, examining a packet of biscuits with unnecessary concentration, cleared his throat diplomatically. "Now, Mrs. Fenn, people meet for all sorts of innocent reasons. Perhaps he was checking the beacon arrangements one final time." At 5 minutes to midnight, Mrs. Fenn's tone suggested personal affront. "And what about that lavender clutched in his hand?" "Lavender doesn't grow behind the willow. I should know. I've walked past it every day for 20 years. Miss Pembroke selected her brown loaf with careful consideration, though her attention focused entirely on the conversation. She noted how Mrs. Fenn's hand trembled slightly as she spoke, and the way Tom Alder kept his left wrist tucked inside his coat sleeve, concealing what appeared to be a fresh, narrow burn mark. Dr. Beatrice Vale entered with her characteristic brisk efficiency, medical bag suggesting early rounds despite the hour. "Good morning, everyone. I trust we're managing well after last night's unfortunate events." "Dr. Vale," Mrs. Hobbs leaned forward conspiratorially. "Surely you can tell us something about poor Mr. Weatherby's condition? His heart, perhaps?" The doctor's expression remained professionally neutral. "I'm afraid I cannot discuss specifics until proper authorities complete their investigation. What I can say is that the pattern of injury suggests complications beyond a simple collapse." This carefully worded statement galvanized the assembled villagers. Mrs. Sarah Lytton, who had been quietly selecting vegetables, turned with the air of someone awaiting precisely this opening. "Complications indeed," she said meaningfully. "Has anyone considered that Giles was meant to light the beacon himself? As newest parish council member, it was his honour. Instead, Arthur had to do it, and by then." She paused dramatically. "Well, poor Giles was beyond help." "The beacon was perfectly safe," Mrs. Fenn interjected with defensive firmness. "Tom and I set it up ourselves, exactly as it should be. No one could have been hurt accidentally." Miss Pembroke noted the slight tremor in Mrs. Fenn's voice, and the persistent scent of lavender that seemed to follow her. Curious, since the Hare and Willow was known for robust aromas of ale and tobacco rather than delicate flowers. As theories multiplied like spring weeds, Miss Pembroke made her purchases and drifted toward the church, where Reverend Lytton was emerging from the vestry with harried expression. On the hymn-book shelf, where Sarah had insisted the ceremonial taper belonged, a brass candle snuffer gleamed with fresh polish, except for a faint crescent of darker tarnish along the inside of its bell, a shape that recalled the curved scorch on Giles Weatherby's cuff with disturbing precision. Near 11 o'clock, Lydia Weatherby appeared, escorted by Doctor, veiled and wrapped in protective layers that implied necessity rather than comfort. Her face held the translucence of someone undecided between bravery and breakdown, but her eyes, when they lifted to the beacon, were curiously clear. She wore new gloves, pale grey instead of the white pair from the previous evening, and carried a parasol bearing a bluish smear at its ferrule that matched the wax Miss Pembroke had noticed on her original glove. "I didn't see him fall," Lydia told Constable Park in a voice accommodating shock but finding only exhaustion. "I was speaking with Doctor Vale near the refreshment table. I remember the strawberry tarts. When Mrs. Fenn offered sympathy and practical assistance, sandwiches, soup, perhaps some lavender water." Lydia's response came too quickly. "I don't need lavender water." Faint colour rose to her cheeks, the body's protest at being betrayed by its associations. Miss Pembroke walked slowly home, her mind cataloguing not just the various accusations and theories, but the subtle tells that accompanied them: Tom's concealed burn, Mrs. Fenn's defensive nervousness, Doctor Vale's careful professional detachment that seemed to hide more personal concerns. Most intriguing was what remained unspoken: the precise nature of that folded programme, the significance of the lavender sprig, and why Lydia Weatherby, despite apparent shock and grief, had left the scene so quickly once her husband was pronounced dead. By noon, the village had transformed ordinary gossip into species of certainty, each theory more elaborate than the last. But Miss Pembroke understood that truth often lay not in what people said, but in what they carefully avoided saying, and in the small, seemingly insignificant details that revealed more about human nature than any amount of speculation ever could. The afternoon brought Miss Pembroke a peculiar sense of purpose that she recognized from her teaching days, the quiet satisfaction of watching patterns emerge from apparent chaos. She positioned herself on the stone bench in the church garden, her knitting providing perfect camouflage for observation, while offering an excellent view of the village green. Her needles clicked with metronomic precision, but her pale blue eyes missed nothing of the subtle drama unfolding before her. The village moved differently today. Conversations clustered in urgent whispers rather than the usual casual encounters, and there was a persistent tendency for people to glance toward the beacon, as if expecting it to confess its secrets. Miss Pembroke had learned that tragedy reveals character the way strong light reveals flaws in fabric. Suddenly, unmistakably, and often quite beautifully. Her first objective was the beacon itself. When the green emptied for the afternoon lull, she approached with the careful steps of someone examining a garden for signs of blight. The ash lay fine as flour around the stone base, disturbed only by the morning's official measurements. But Miss Pembroke's trained eye caught what Constable Park's tape measure had missed, a crescent of darker stone where heat had kissed more intimately than elsewhere, and nearby, pressed into a patch of softer earth, the faint circular impression of something not quite the size of a teacup. More intriguing was a tiny flake of something hard and blue lodged beside a protruding root. She touched it with a gloved fingertip and found it brittle, like cooled wax. The discovery vanished when a young dog came racing up with enthusiastic destruction, but Miss Pembroke felt no loss. When one could follow the scent of the loaf, there was no need to pocket crumbs. Her next destination was the church, where Reverend Lytton emerged from the vestry with the harried expression of a man whose carefully ordered world had been thoroughly disarranged. On the hymn-book shelf where Sarah had insisted the ceremonial taper belonged, a brass candle snuffer gleamed with fresh polish, except for a faint crescent of darker tarnish along the inside of its bell, a shape that recalled the curved scorch on Giles Weatherby's cuff with disturbing precision. "Arthur seems quite distressed," Miss Pembroke observed gently to Sarah, who was arranging flowers with the fierce concentration of someone channeling anxiety into activity. "He blames himself, though heaven knows why," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the particular sharpness that accompanies suppressed worry. "The taper was moved yesterday evening. I put it on the shelf. Then it wasn't there. Then later it was. Arthur claims absent-mindedness, but I know interference when I see it." "Interference," Miss Pembroke repeated thoughtfully. "A most useful word. Did Mr. Weatherby visit the vestry yesterday?" Sarah's pause was brief but telling. "He consulted the arrangements list, said he wanted everything official. Between us he seemed unsettled, not himself at all. Then Lydia came to fetch him, quite agitated about losing a glove. I confess, I find losing a husband rather more serious than losing a glove." The Hare and Willow carried an afternoon hush broken only by the gentle clink of glass, and Mrs. Fenn's authoritative whisper to someone in the back room. "No more talk of it here, Tom. Mind your wrist." Miss Pembroke settled at a corner table and allowed the pub to reveal itself anew. Dried lavender hung in small bunches along the back wall, a rustic gesture toward cleanliness that would have been unremarkable if the scent hadn't matched precisely the fragrance that had risen from Giles Weatherby's closed hand. On the bar lay a stack of account papers tied with narrow blue ribbon, the same shade as the flake she'd discovered at the beacon. Mrs. Fenn untied the topmost bundle with fingers that wanted to be steady but weren't quite managing the deception. "Lovely colour," Miss Pembroke observed of the ribbon. "So festive." "Came off a hat box," Mrs. Fenn replied too quickly. "Fancy one. Can't keep everything, so I use what's to hand." Tom Alder emerged from the back room carrying a wooden crate, his face faintly flushed with exertion or embarrassment. When he caught sight of Miss Pembroke, his left hand moved instinctively toward his wrist, the same gesture she'd observed that morning, now clearly protecting a band of reddened skin shaped like a crescent. His fingernails bore traces of something paler than soot, caught at the edges like dried paste or cooled wax. At the Weatherby cottage, Lydia received her with the careful composure of someone wearing grief like an unfamiliar garment. In the sitting room, a writing desk stood open, revealing a stick of blue sealing wax alongside a brass seal engraved W and W, and a scrap of ribbon identical to the one at the pub. A parasol leaned against the chair, its ferrule bearing a bluish smear that might have been wax or might have been coincidence, if Miss Pembroke believed in coincidences, which she decidedly did not. "Dr. Vale has been very attentive," Lydia mentioned, adjusting her new grey gloves with nervous precision. "She says I should rest, but rest seems impossible when one's mind insists on reviewing every detail." "Details have their own importance," Miss Pembroke agreed gently. "Your husband seemed troubled yesterday evening." "He went out after dinner to see Tom about the beacon arrangements," Lydia said, then caught herself as if the words had escaped without permission. He was always so particular about official duties. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Pembroke made her careful way home, her mind cataloguing not just the physical evidence, wax, ribbon, lavender, the telling crescent that appeared on snuffer, stone and skin, but the more subtle patterns of human behaviour. Tom's concealed burn and defensive posture, Mrs. Fenn's nervous energy, and her pub's convenient supply of lavender. Lydia's new gloves and careful answers, Dr. Vale's protective hovering and professional discretion that seemed to hide personal concern. The pattern emerging was not one of simple guilt and innocence, but of a conspiracy of circumstances, each person contributing elements that individually appeared innocent but collectively created the conditions for murder. Knowledge, materials, opportunity and motive had aligned with tragic precision, like planets in some malevolent conjunction. Miss Pembroke understood that the truth often revealed itself not through dramatic confrontation, but through the careful arrangement of circumstances that allowed guilty parties to expose themselves through their own reactions. Tomorrow would bring opportunities to test her growing theory, to observe how each suspect responded when presented with carefully chosen stimuli. She had learned, over many years of watching human nature reveal itself in moments of crisis, that murder was rarely as simple as it appeared. This case seemed to confirm her experience. Not one killer, but several people whose individual actions had combined to create something far more deadly than any of them had intended alone. The evening settled over Ashcombe in the Wold with deceptive peace, but Miss Pembroke knew that beneath the village's serene surface, guilt was already beginning its inevitable work of self-revelation. The next morning brought Inspector Hale from the county constabulary, a compact man with steel-rimmed spectacles and the particular brand of quiet authority that comes from years of reducing human complexity to manageable facts. Miss Pembroke observed his arrival from her kitchen window, noting how his brisk stride and leather portfolio suggested a mind already organising evidence into neat categories of guilt and innocence. By 9 o'clock, the village hall had been transformed into a temporary interview room, with Constable Park hovering nervously at Inspector Hale's elbow, like a student hoping to impress a demanding teacher. The inspector's first action was to examine the folded programme found in Giles Weatherby's hand, studying the handwritten message with the concentrated attention of someone reading scripture. 11:55. Behind the willow, he read aloud to Constable Park. Pre-arranged meeting. The killer lured him there with this note, then struck when the beacon lighting provided perfect cover. He held the paper to the light, examining the handwriting with professional interest. Educated script, but disguised. Someone trying to appear less refined than they are. The systematic interview process began with methodical precision. Tom Alder was summoned first, emerging 40 minutes later with the hollow-eyed expression of a man who had discovered that innocence was no protection against circumstantial evidence. Miss Pembroke, positioned strategically in the hall's anteroom with her knitting, observed how his left hand kept moving toward his sleeve, protecting the crescent-shaped burn that had become suddenly significant. Mrs. Fenn followed, her usual confidence replaced by defensive indignation. Tom Alder wouldn't hurt a soul, she declared loudly enough for the waiting villagers to hear. This is all nonsense based on coincidence and spite. But Inspector Hale was building his case with the patience of a craftsman. When Dr. Vale confirmed the burn pattern on Giles Weatherby's jacket matched precisely the curved edge of a brass candle snuffer, the inspector's satisfaction was visible. A visit to the church vestry revealed the missing piece. The ceremonial snuffer bore traces of blue wax along its inner rim, and faint scorch marks suggested recent exposure to intense heat. Ingenious, really, Inspector Hale explained to the assembled officials. The killer used sealing wax to attach the snuffer to a wooden handle, creating an improvised weapon that could deliver a fatal blow while keeping the attacker safely distant from the beacon's flames. The blue wax fragments we found at the scene matched the residue under Mr. Alder's fingernails. The motive emerged during the afternoon interviews. Giles Weatherby's files revealed correspondence with Darlow and Sons of Upper Badgerley, a contracting firm offering to handle the parish maintenance work at considerably reduced rates. Tom Alder's 23-year tenure as village handyman was about to end, taking with it the steady income that saw him through each winter. Weatherby called him in yesterday afternoon, Inspector Hale reported to Constable Park. Officially to discuss beacon safety, but really to inform him about the contract change. Several witnesses saw them arguing near the church. Alder was overheard saying, "You can't just cast people aside like worn tools." Lydia Weatherby, interviewed with appropriate delicacy given her recent bereavement, confirmed that her husband had been troubled about having to make difficult decisions regarding village employment. Her composed manner and precise answers impressed Inspector Hale, who noted approvingly that grief hadn't clouded her memory of events. Miss Pembroke requested a brief word with the inspector as the afternoon interviews concluded. "The handwriting on that note," she observed gently, "seems rather refined for someone whose work keeps him outdoors with tools. The letters flow like someone accustomed to correspondence rather than invoices." Inspector Hale adjusted his spectacles with the patience of someone addressing a well-meaning amateur. "Disguised handwriting is elementary deception, Miss Pembroke. Alder's intelligent enough to attempt misdirection." "Of course," she agreed mildly. "Though I wonder about the lavender sprig in poor Mr. Weatherby's hand. Tom Alder has mentioned that lavender gives him headaches. Seems curious he would carry it." "Staging?" Inspector Hale replied confidently. "Attempting to suggest someone else's involvement. The oldest trick in the criminal's handbook." By evening, Tom Alder had been taken to the county station for formal questioning. The village settled into the satisfied exhaustion that follows, crisis resolved, the obvious suspect identified, the evidence compelling, the motive clear. Conversations in the Hare and Willow centred on how they had all sensed something troubling about Tom's recent behaviour, how his pride in his work had always bordered on obsession, how desperation could drive even gentlemen to violence. Miss Pembroke walked slowly home as twilight gathered, her mind troubled by the very neatness of the solution. In her experience, real guilt rarely announced itself so conveniently, with evidence arranged like items in a shop window. The blue wax appeared everywhere, on Tom's fingers, at the beacon, on the church snuffer, but also on Lydia's parasol and binding Mrs. Fenn's account papers. The burn mark was certainly suspicious, but its curve suggested someone catching a falling object rather than wielding a weapon. Most troubling was the villagers' eager acceptance of Tom's guilt. People wanted their world restored to safety, their trust in fundamental order confirmed. An obvious culprit provided that comfort, allowing them to believe that evil was identifiable, containable, and ultimately defeatable by proper authority. But Miss Pembroke had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most innocent, who understood that the best hiding place was in plain sight, protected by others' assumptions and their own carefully cultivated reputations. The real killer remained free, she was certain, shielded by the villagers' relief at having found someone to blame. As she reached her cottage gate, she paused to examine the evening primroses blooming along her garden path. Like truth, they opened only in darkness, revealing their beauty when others slept. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to observe, to question, and to gently disturb the comfortable certainty that justice had been served. The obvious solution was rarely the correct one, and Tom Alder's arrest had been far too convenient for her peace of mind. The following morning brought Miss Pembroke a sense of purpose sharpened by restless sleep. Her mind had been turning over the blue ribbon like a puzzle piece that belonged somewhere specific, if only she could determine where. The village moved with the subdued satisfaction of crisis resolved, but Miss Pembroke had learned to distrust solutions that arrived too neatly packaged. She made her way to Mrs. Hobbs's shop with the deliberate pace of someone who understood that truth often revealed itself in the mundane details others overlooked. The morning light streaming through the shop windows illuminated dust motes that danced like tiny clues waiting to be gathered. "Good morning, Miss Pembroke," Mrs. Hobbs called from behind her counter, where she was arranging a display of ribbons with a particular care that suggested business had been brisk. "Brown loaf today? I've some lovely French blue ribbon just arrived, though I confess we've sold quite a bit of that shade recently." Miss Pembroke approached the ribbon display with genuine interest. The blue was distinctive, not navy, not cornflower, but that precise shade she had noticed in so many locations. "How curious! Popular colour, is it?" "Oh yes, Mrs. Weatherby ordered several yards some months back, said she needed it for correspondence. Then Mrs. Fenn took a length Tuesday morning, along with brass polish and lavender oil, said it was for festival preparations." Mrs. Hobbs lowered her voice conspiratorially. Between us, I think she was trying to make the pub more respectable for the occasion. Miss Pembroke selected her bread while processing this information. Lydia Weatherby had ordered the ribbon months ago, well before any immediate need. Mrs. Fenn had purchased it the morning of the festival, along with materials that now seemed far more significant than mere cleaning supplies. "Your receipt system is admirably thorough," Miss Pembroke observed, noting the spike of paper slips beside the till. "Such careful records must be invaluable for inventory." Mrs. Hobbs beamed with pride. "Every transaction recorded. Father always said a shopkeeper's memory was only as good as her written records." She gestured toward a fallen receipt near the counter. "Customers sometimes drop their copies, but I keep duplicates of everything." Miss Pembroke stooped to retrieve the wayward paper, noting as she did that it bore yesterday's date and read, "Fenn brass polish, large, lavender oil, bottle, ribbon blue, festival morning." The timing was precise. Mrs. Fenn had purchased these items the very morning of the murder, not days before as might be expected for festival preparations. Outside the shop, Miss Pembroke made her careful way back to the beacon site. In daylight, with the crowd's trampling settled, new details emerged. Near the base of the ancient stone, she found what she sought: a tiny bead of hardened wax, blue as summer sky, with a single thread of satin caught in its glossy surface. The thread was too fine to be coincidental, too precisely placed to be accidental. Her next destination was the Hare and Willow, where Mrs. Fenn was polishing brass fittings with the sort of vigorous attention that suggested either exceptional pride or nervous energy. A bottle of lavender oil sat open on the counter, its sweet scent mingling with the pub's usual aromas of ale and tobacco. "You've made everything shine beautifully," Miss Pembroke observed, settling at a corner table. The brass polish was well chosen. Mrs. Fenn's hand stilled momentarily on the rail. "Mrs.?" Hobbs recommended the large tin, said it would last through several cleanings. She resumed polishing with renewed vigour. "One must keep standards, especially with all these official visitors." Miss Pembroke noted the account papers on the far end of the bar, still tied with that distinctive blue ribbon. The bow was practical, ends cut at precise angles, but one knot bore a tiny glint, a fleck of dried wax that matched the beacon fragment perfectly. "Such lovely ribbon for business papers," she commented. "Quite elegant." "Tom brought it by Tuesday evening," Mrs. Fenn replied quickly. "Said it was left over from some church project. I thought it too pretty to waste." The explanation came too readily, with the particular smoothness that accompanies rehearsed responses. More significantly, it placed Tom Alder at the pub the evening before the murder, distributing ribbon that would later appear in multiple incriminating locations. Miss Pembroke's afternoon visit to the Weatherby cottage revealed additional pieces of the puzzle. Lydia received her with composed grief, but her sitting room told a different story. The writing desk bore evidence of recent activity: sealing wax with multiple finger impressions, a brass seal marked W and W, and scraps of that same blue ribbon. On the side table, personal papers awaited posting, bound with ribbon cut in the same precise angles she had observed at the pub. "Such thoughtful organisation during your time of grief," Miss Pembroke observed gently. "The ribbon adds a dignified touch to correspondence." Lydia's composure flickered almost imperceptibly. "Giles always insisted on proper presentation. I find comfort in maintaining his standards." She gestured toward the papers. "Legal matters require immediate attention, regardless of personal circumstances." The explanation was reasonable, even admirable, but Miss Pembroke noted the quantity of ribbon used, far more than necessary for the visible papers. More intriguingly, a crystal bottle of lavender water sat prominently on the mantel, despite Lydia's earlier protestations about disliking the scent. Dr. Vale's surgery provided the final piece of the immediate puzzle. The doctor, usually so composed, seemed distracted, her movements lacking their typical precision. On her desk lay medical supplies bound with ordinary twine, but Miss Pembroke noticed a small smear of blue wax on a discarded glove. "I understand you purchased sealing wax from Mrs. Hobbs recently," Miss Pembroke mentioned casually. "Blue, rather than your usual red." Dr. Vale's pause was measured. They had no red in the proper consistency. Colour is irrelevant for medical purposes. She removed the stained glove with a rueful smile. "Brass doorknob, Our village seems determined to shine these days. Walking home as afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Pembroke felt the pattern crystallizing with disturbing clarity. The blue ribbon hadn't appeared randomly throughout the village. It had been systematically distributed, creating a trail of evidence that led everywhere and nowhere. Each person she had visited possessed elements of the murder weapon's construction: ribbon for binding, wax for attachment, polish for cleaning, lavender for misdirection. Most significantly, each had acquired these materials at precisely the right times to suggest coordination rather than coincidence. Mrs. Fenn's Tuesday morning purchases, Tom's Tuesday evening ribbon distribution, Lydia's months-old ribbon order that provided the original supply. It spoke not of individual guilt, but of collective planning. The obvious solution Inspector Hale had embraced was not wrong, merely incomplete. Tom Alder was indeed involved, but as a participant in something far more complex than desperate violence. The real conspiracy lay in the village's own desire to solve its problems through collective action, each person contributing elements that individually appeared innocent but collectively created the means for murder. Miss Pembroke reached her cottage gate as evening primroses began to open in her garden. Like truth, they revealed their beauty only when others slept, showing their true nature in darkness. Tomorrow would bring opportunities to test her theory, to observe how each suspect responded when confronted with the evidence of their careful coordination. The blue ribbon had been more than a clue. It was a signature, binding together a conspiracy of ordinary people who had convinced themselves that removing one troublesome individual would restore their village's peace. The most dangerous criminals, she reflected, were often those who believed their motives were entirely justified. The morning brought Miss Pembroke a sense of purpose sharpened by the previous day's discoveries. She dressed with particular care, selecting her most reassuring cardigan and pinning her silver owl brooch with deliberate precision. Today would require all her accumulated understanding of human nature and its capacity for self-deception. Her first destination was the post office, where Mrs. Pritchard sorted mail with sovereign authority. A misdirected telegram lay among the general delivery items, time-stamped the previous afternoon at 4 o'clock. Miss Pembroke read it with growing understanding. Darlow contract cancelled. Alternative arrangements unnecessary. G.W. The message had arrived 6 hours before the murder, making the evening's tragic events not only morally inexcusable, but practically pointless. Giles Weatherby had changed his mind about replacing Tom Alder, but the telegram had reached its destination too late to prevent the conspiracy from proceeding. At the church hall, Sarah Lytton directed the Flower Guild with military precision, arranging salvaged blooms into more penitential displays. Lavender stood prominently in a tall crock, spare sprigs tucked among white campion and rosemary. Her jaw tightened at Miss Pembroke's approach, then relaxed into something resembling relief. "Such a comfort," Miss Pembroke murmured, selecting a lavender sprig. "Always suggests home and good order." "There is much to set right after recent events," Sarah agreed, her voice carrying an edge. "The vestry remains in disarray." "Arthur cannot bear to go in, poor man." Miss Pembroke's gaze drifted to Sarah's sewing basket, where a spool of that familiar French blue ribbon bound a sheaf of hymn supplements. The cut ends were precise, measured, matching exactly those she had observed at the pub and Weatherby cottage. "Mr. Weatherby was quite diligent about church affairs," Miss Pembroke observed gently. Sarah's needle paused mid-stitch. "He wished to be. Pressed for transparency in all parish matters. Audits of funds that have been managed perfectly well for years." Her cheeks flushed with indignation. "Small parish budgets require flexibility, Miss Pembroke. When families cannot afford coal, one makes certain transfers. I am not careless with money." "An admirable compassion," Miss Pembroke replied. "And Mr. Weatherby objected to such arrangements?" "He objected to anything not properly documented by 3 committees. Spoke of selling the Glebe meadow for housing development, necessary revenue streams, and replacing Tom with those Darlow contractors. He would have paved the village green if a pamphlet suggested it increased efficiency." The hard word, replacing, hung between them, binding Tom's threatened livelihood to Sarah's administrative grievances, and the meadow many considered sacred ground. At the Hare and Willow, Mrs. Fenn polished glasses with mechanical precision, her usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. The lavender oil sat prominently displayed, its sweet scent now seeming less like rustic charm and more like evidence of careful preparation. "I've been reflecting on Tuesday evening," Miss Pembroke mentioned conversationally, producing the telegram, when Tom distributed that lovely blue ribbon, though I confess this message puzzles me. Mr. Weatherby had cancelled the Darlow contract after all. Tom's position was secure. The glass slipped from Mrs. Fenn's nerveless fingers, shattering on the stone floor with a sound like breaking certainty. Her face crumpled with terrible understanding. "Secure?" "But we thought—" He said the decision was final. Miss Pembroke helped sweep the fragments while Mrs. Fenn stood frozen, realizing their careful planning had been based on outdated information. The crime they had committed to save Tom's livelihood had been unnecessary from its conception. Dr. Vale's surgery revealed the final piece of immediate understanding. The doctor sat behind her desk with the hollow expression of someone who had discovered the full extent of her complicity. Medical supplies lay scattered before her: bandages, antiseptic, pain medication, preparations for treating injuries after violent events. "Giles had a heart condition, Doctor," Vale admitted when pressed gently. "Well managed, but stress could exacerbate it significantly. The shock of confrontation, physical exertion, emotional strain, any combination might prove fatal." "You prepared for medical emergencies that evening," Miss Pembroke observed, noting the ready supplies. "I always prepare for festival gatherings." "Accidents happen," Dr. Vale's professional composure wavered. "Though I confess I expected different injuries." The pattern crystallized with disturbing clarity as Miss Pembroke walked slowly home. The blue ribbon hadn't appeared randomly throughout the village. It had been systematically distributed, creating connections between conspirators. Each person possessed elements of the murder method: ribbon for binding, wax for attachment, polish for cleaning, lavender for misdirection. Most significantly, each had acquired these materials at precisely coordinated times. Mrs. Fenn's Tuesday morning purchases, Tom's Tuesday evening distribution, Sarah's church access to the ceremonial snuffer. It spoke not of individual desperation, but collective planning. The telegram revealed the tragedy's ultimate irony. Their conspiracy had proceeded based on obsolete information, making their crime not only wrong but utterly pointless. Giles Weatherby had already cancelled the contract that threatened Tom's livelihood, but the message arrived too late to prevent the evening's deadly coordination. Miss Pembroke reached her cottage as evening primroses began opening in her garden. Like truth, they revealed their beauty only in darkness, showing their true nature when the world was quiet enough to see clearly. Tomorrow would bring opportunities to test her theory about how good intentions had been twisted into something far more sinister than simple murder. Dawn had scarcely shaken the last dew from the hedgerows when the frantic clanging of St. Martin's bell shattered the morning quiet. Miss Pembroke, already dressed and preparing her breakfast, recognized the particular urgency of the peal, not the measured call to worship, but the desperate summons that spoke of crisis. Smoke rose in a dark ribbon above the yew trees, and before she had collected her walking stick, she knew both the direction and, she suspected, the intention behind this new calamity. She arrived at the church behind the first bucket carriers, their urgency tempered by the British instinct to form orderly lines even in chaos. The smoke poured thickest from the vestry windows, while the nave itself remained untouched, morning light falling with serene indifference through stained glass, upon pews that smelled faintly of beeswax and yesterday's lilies. The vestry, by contrast, coughed and smouldered like a wounded animal, its ancient timbers protesting this violation of their centuries-long peace. Reverend Lytton struggled with a stubborn window catch, soot streaking his clerical collar, while Tom Harkness from the farm shouldered past to wrench the frame open. Sarah Lytton's voice cut through the tumult with uncharacteristic authority, directing the bucket brigade with military precision. "Careful with the ledgers," she commanded, though Miss Pembroke noted that Sarah's concern seemed more performative than genuine, her movements too practiced for someone confronting unexpected disaster. Within 20 minutes and several gallons of water applied with surprising village efficiency, the worst had passed. The vestry presented a study in calculated destruction, a blackened patch at the base of the record cabinet, scorched edges on the lowest shelf where parish documents had been stored, and a curling ruin of paper that had once been the church accounts ledger. The acrid smell of smoke mingled with something sweeter and entirely out of place, the heavy scent of lavender oil. Inspector Hale appeared with his characteristic brisk authority, Constable Park trailing behind with an armful of damp blankets. The inspector knelt beside the damaged cabinet, with the wary respect of someone who understood that fire could restart its arguments without warning. He lifted a warped tin from the floor between two fingers, examining it with professional interest. "Polish tin," he announced, "and this—" He indicated a cracked bottle lying in a star of glass near the window. "Lavender oil, accelerants, both of them. This was deliberate." Sarah stepped forward, her face bearing the appropriate mixture of shock and indignation. "That cupboard held our cleaning supplies, brass polish, oils, candles for ceremonies." Her voice caught with convincing distress. "Arthur, the ceremonial snuffer, it always hangs there on that hook." The hook stood empty, its brass ring gleaming clean against the smoke-darkened wood. The missing snuffer, the same implement that had been used to murder Giles Weatherby, had vanished, presumably taken by whoever had set this fire. Miss Pembroke stepped carefully through the damp ash, her eyes cataloguing details while others addressed the obvious. The pattern of burning on the cabinet's lowest shelf formed a familiar crescent, deeper at one edge than the other, matching the scorch mark she had observed on Giles Weatherby's jacket. Near the window, pooled where heat had concentrated with particular enthusiasm, lay a smear of cooled wax the exact shade of summer sky. Beside it, half buried in wet ash, she discovered a scrap of fine satin ribbon, blue as always, its end cut at that same precise angle she had noted throughout the village. More intriguingly, the window latch bore traces of blue wax pressed into its mechanism, and the outer sill showed a delicate scuff mark, a crescent-shaped indentation where a narrow heel had caught during someone's hurried exit. Not the broad stamp of Sarah's practical shoes, nor the rectangular mark of clerical footwear, but something more fashionable and decidedly feminine. "The vestry was locked last night?" Inspector Hale inquired, his attention sharpening as the implications became clear. "Locked at 7, Sarah replied, with perhaps too much certainty. "I checked twice. Arthur left his keys on the hall table, but—" She paused, some memory interrupting her prepared response. "Lydia Weatherby borrowed a spare key last month for flower arrangements when I was indisposed. I haven't had it returned." The admission hung in the smoky air like an accusation. Lydia arrived moments later, pale but composed, her grey gloves now bearing darker smudges at the fingertips. Dr. Vale accompanied her, medical bag in hand, her presence suggesting either coincidence or careful preparation. "I meant to return the key after the festival," Lydia explained with the faintest rise of colour in her cheeks. "There has been so much to manage since Giles's death. His papers, the solicitors, everything requiring attention." "You have the key still?" Inspector Hale's voice carried new interest. "At home, on the hall table," Lydia replied, the words selected with careful precision for their plausibility. Dr. Vale stepped closer to her patient, placing a protective hand on Lydia's arm. "She was with me at the surgery this morning from 8 until 9:15, she offered without being asked. "I can confirm her whereabouts completely." Miss Pembroke observed this exchange with growing understanding. "How fortunate," she said mildly, "that you were both so conveniently near when the alarm sounded. Such prompt response to crisis." Constable Park, eager to contribute to the investigation, held up a charred rectangle between his tongs. "Sir, a note, half burned, was tucked under the window frame." He laid it carefully on an undamaged section of table. The surviving portion read, 9:30. Vestry. The handwriting bore the same awkward elegance as the previous message, education disguised as common script. "Another appointment," Inspector Hale murmured, his confidence wavering as the neat categories of his solved case began to dissolve. "Like the meeting behind the willow." But Alder's in custody. The implications were clear and troubling. Tom Alder could not have set this fire, could not have stolen the ceremonial snuffer, could not have arranged another clandestine meeting. Either he had an accomplice, or the entire foundation of the case against him was built on carefully constructed deception. Miss Pembroke watched the assembled villagers' reactions more closely than she considered the inspector's words. Sarah flinched, not at the thought of conspiracy, but at the sight of her damaged domain. Mrs. Fenn, who had arrived with sandwiches as if feeding others could repair moral fabric, froze at the mention of blue wax, her lips forming words she didn't speak. Lydia's gaze flicked once, briefly as a heartbeat, to the empty hook where the snuffer should have hung, a glance as telling as a signed confession. As the morning progressed and official procedures consumed the inspector's attention, Miss Pembroke reflected on the true purpose of this second incident. The fire had not been random destruction but surgical precision, eliminating specific records while creating general chaos, removing the murder weapon while providing perfect cover for its disappearance. Most significantly, it forced reconsideration of Tom Alder's guilt, while simultaneously providing new evidence of conspiracy. Someone was orchestrating events with theatrical precision, using smoke and mirrors to direct attention where they wished it to fall. The blue ribbon that had bound the village's evidence together was not coincidence but signature, marking a conspiracy that grew more sophisticated with each revelation. Walking slowly home as the last wisps of smoke dissipated into morning air, Miss Pembroke understood that she was no longer investigating a simple murder but a carefully choreographed performance. The real killer remained hidden behind layers of misdirection, protected by the village's own desire to find simple answers to complex questions. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to test her growing theory about the true nature of this conspiracy, one that involved not desperate individuals but coordinated deception by people who believed their cause justified any means necessary to achieve it. Inspector Hale returned to the village hall with the expression of a man whose carefully constructed edifice of certainty had developed alarming cracks. The vestry fire had shattered his neat categories of guilt and innocence, leaving him to contemplate the uncomfortable possibility that Tom Alder's arrest had been premature. He spread the morning's evidence across the commandeered table with the methodical precision of someone attempting to impose order on chaos. Miss Pembroke observed his struggle from her strategic position near the window, her knitting needles clicking with deceptive tranquility. She had learned that official investigations often missed the subtle currents of human relationship that truly drove events, focusing instead on the obvious evidence that might itself be carefully orchestrated. The first revelation came from Mrs. Pritchard at the post office, who produced the misdirected telegram with professional reluctance. "Arrived at 4 yesterday afternoon," she explained, adjusting her spectacles. "Addressed to Parish Office. Could mean the rectory or the hall. I set it aside to ask Sarah which she preferred. Then with the fire this morning, well, you can imagine the confusion." Inspector Hale read the message with growing understanding. Darlow contract cancelled. Alternative arrangements unnecessary. GW. The timestamp showed it had arrived 6 hours before the murder, making the evening's events not only tragic but entirely pointless. Giles Weatherby had already secured Tom Alder's position. "Did anyone inquire about this telegram?" Miss Pembroke asked gently. Mrs. Pritchard hesitated, memory and discretion warring visibly. "A boy came just before closing, said the lady at the rectory wanted anything marked parish sent up directly. Polite lad, though I didn't recognize him." At the rectory, Sarah Lytton received them with the brittle composure of someone holding too many secrets. Singed papers lay scattered across her desk, salvaged fragments that told their own story of selective preservation. When pressed about the telegram, her careful control wavered. "If such a message existed, it would have changed everything," she admitted, her voice carrying the weight of terrible understanding. But Giles had already announced his intentions publicly. The damage to village morale was done, regardless of any last-minute reversals. Miss Pembroke noted the careful phrasing, "if such a message existed," and the way Sarah's eyes avoided the ash-stained papers that might once have contained evidence of financial irregularities. The church accounts had been conveniently destroyed, along with any record of the flexible arrangements that had kept the village's most vulnerable residents warm through difficult winters. Dr. Vale's surgery provided the next piece of the puzzle. The doctor, usually so composed, seemed strained, her movements lacking their typical precision. When Inspector Hale questioned her about Lydia's alibi, her response came with suspicious promptness. "Mrs. Weatherby was with me from 8 until well past 9, she confirmed. Her sleep has been poor since the tragedy. I thought tea and conversation preferable to medication." She paused, then added with careful emphasis, "We left together when the church bell sounded the alarm." Miss Pembroke observed the doctor's left-handed pen grip and recalled the disguised handwriting on the burned note. "Such dedication to your patients," she commented mildly, "even before 8 in the morning." "Medical emergencies don't observe convenient hours, Doctor." Vale replied, but her eyes flickered toward the window that faced the church, and Miss Pembroke noticed the faint blue stain on her cuff that matched the wax found at the vestry. At the Hare and Willow, Mrs. Fenn's usual confidence had crumbled entirely. She served tea with trembling hands while confessing her terror at the telegram's implications. "Poor Tom, arrested for something that wasn't even necessary," she whispered, "and now someone's destroyed the evidence that might have saved him." "Evidence of what, precisely?" Inspector Hale inquired with sharpened interest. Mrs. Fenn's composure collapsed entirely. "Giles was investigating the pub's lease arrangements. Said the rent was unrealistically low for such a prime location, threatened to raise it to market rates or sell the property entirely." Her voice broke. "It would have ruined me completely, Inspector. 23 years I've run this place, keeping it respectable, serving the community. He would have destroyed it all for the sake of proper documentation." The afternoon brought Lydia Weatherby to the hall, her widow's composure now showing hairline fractures. She carried a leather portfolio that she placed before Inspector Hale with ceremonial gravity. "I found additional correspondence among Giles' papers," she announced. "Letters that change everything about his intentions." The documents revealed not just the cancelled Darlow contract, but arrangements for Tom Alder's pension supplement and charitable provisions for several village families, funded through the sale of Giles's personal investments. Miss Pembroke examined the papers with interest, noting their pristine condition and the absence of any filing marks that would suggest they had been stored with other documents. "Such thoughtful provisions," she observed, though curious that they remained hidden until now. "Giles preferred his charitable work to remain private," Lydia replied quickly. "He said public knowledge would compromise the recipient's dignity." As evening approached, Inspector Hale found himself confronting an investigation that had multiplied rather than simplified. Each new revelation created fresh questions, while the original crime seemed to recede behind layers of motive and opportunity that touched half the village. Miss Pembroke walked slowly home, her mind cataloguing not just the evidence but the careful coordination behind its presentation. Tomorrow would bring opportunities to test her growing theory about a conspiracy that relied not on individual cunning, but on collective self-deception, a village that had convinced itself that removing one troublesome individual would restore their carefully maintained world. The blue ribbon that bound their evidence together was not coincidence but signature, marking a web of complicity that grew more sophisticated with each revelation. Miss Pembroke began her delicate experiment with the methodical precision of a chess master contemplating an endgame. She had spent the pre-dawn hours preparing her sitting room for what she privately termed a gathering of evidence, though she suspected her guests would consider it merely neighbourly tea. The morning light filtered through lace curtains onto a carefully arranged tableau, her mother's brass sugar scuttle positioned prominently on the mantel, its bell-shaped form bearing an unmistakable resemblance to a ceremonial snuffer, and beside it, a folded festival programme with a message written in deliberately disguised script, 9:30, behind the memorial stone. At precisely 10 o'clock, she telephoned each of her intended guests with the gentle authority that had once commanded unruly schoolchildren. Would they join her for tea to discuss a memorial for poor Giles? Such a tragedy required community response, and their particular perspectives would be invaluable. Each woman accepted with the careful politeness that accompanied social obligation, though Miss Pembroke noted the varying degrees of hesitation in their voices. Lydia Weatherby arrived first, her widow's composure intact, but her grey gloves bearing those telltale blue smudges at the fingertips. She settled into the offered chair with graceful precision, though her eyes immediately found the brass ornament on the mantel and lingered there with unmistakable recognition. Dr. Vale followed, carrying her medical bag with the automatic efficiency of someone who never travelled without professional tools. Her left hand, Miss Pembroke observed, bore a faint crescent-shaped mark along the palm. precisely the sort of injury one might sustain from grasping a heated metal object in haste. Mrs. Fenn bustled in with nervous energy, her usual confidence replaced by the brittle cheer of someone performing normalcy. The scent of lavender clung to her. Clothing! And when she removed her coat, Miss Pembroke noticed the blue ribbon tying back her hair, the same distinctive shade that had appeared throughout the village like a signature of conspiracy. Sarah Lytton entered last, her punctuality absolute, and her gaze immediately cataloguing the room's contents with administrative thoroughness. She paused at the sight of the folded programme, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognised both the paper and the handwriting that adorned it. "Such a comfort to gather in friendship during difficult times," Miss Pembroke murmured, pouring tea with ceremonial care. "I thought we might each contribute a memory of Giles for a small memorial book. Something personal, written in your own hand." She produced elegant stationery and her fountain pen, a vintage instrument with a serpentine nib that rewarded careful penmanship, but punished haste with ink blots and catches. Sarah wrote first, her administrative script marching across the page with military precision. Mrs. Fenn followed, her rounded letters betraying the careful education of someone who had worked to improve her station. Dr. Vale accepted the pen in her left hand, and despite her attempt at disguise, the same unconscious traits emerged that Miss Pembroke had observed on the mysterious notes. High crossbars on the letter T, peculiarly looped R's, and the telltale gaps between strokes where medical training had emphasized precision over flow. "How lovely," Miss Pembroke commented, studying the handwriting samples with apparent pleasure while mentally comparing them to the messages found at both crime scenes. As she reached for the teapot to refill cups, she allowed it to overbalance slightly, sending a stream of amber liquid toward the table's edge. The resulting flurry of napkins and apologies provided perfect cover for observation. Lydia instinctively caught the dripping tea with her forearm, pushing up her sleeve to protect the fabric. The exposed skin bore a narrow crescent of reddened flesh, healed but unmistakable, exactly matching the curved edge of a brass implement heated beyond comfortable handling. "How clumsy of me," Miss Pembroke apologized, though her pale blue eyes missed nothing of the mark or Lydia's quick attempt to conceal it. At precisely 9:30, the church bell chimed, and as if summoned by the sound, young Timothy Hobbs appeared at the garden gate with breathless urgency. "Miss Pembroke," Inspector Hale sends word, "something's been found behind the memorial stone. Says would the ladies come if they've a moment to spare?" The effect was immediate and revealing. Mrs. Fenn's teacup rattled against its saucer as her gaze flew to the brass ornament on the mantel, then darted away as if the object might betray her secrets. Sarah's expression tightened with calculation, her eyes flicking between the folded programme and the clock as she measured alibis and timetables. Dr. Vale's hand moved protectively to Lydia's arm, but it was Lydia's reaction that proved most telling. A sharp intake of breath followed by an instinctive reach toward her handbag, where a borrowed key might rest. "Inspector Hale moves with admirable efficiency," Miss Pembroke observed, rising with the serene composure of an experienced hostess. "Shall we see what assistance we might provide?" The walk to the memorial stone revealed the true sophistication of the village conspiracy. Each woman positioned herself with unconscious precision. Doctor. Vale near the churchyard gate, controlling the most direct escape route. Mrs. Fenn approaching from the pub direction, completing a careful encirclement. Sarah emerging from behind a weathered headstone where she had clearly been observing, and Lydia moving with the determined purpose of someone who knew exactly what evidence might be discovered. At the memorial stone, Constable Park waited with official solemnity beside a carefully disturbed patch of earth. No actual evidence lay exposed. Miss Pembroke's message had been designed to test reactions, not reveal artifacts, but the assembled women's behaviour told its own story. "Ladies," Miss Pembroke said gently, her walking stick planted firmly in the soft ground, "I believe you've all received my invitation." The silence that followed was weighted with recognition and calculation. 4 women stood in the morning sunlight, their carefully maintained facades crumbling as they realized their collective guilt had been not only discovered, but deliberately exposed. The blue ribbon that had bound their conspiracy together now threatened to become the cord that would hang them all. Miss Pembroke understood that she had successfully tested her theory, confirming what she had long suspected. The murder of Giles Weatherby had been not the desperate act of one individual, but the coordinated effort of a community that had convinced itself that removing one troublesome person would restore their carefully ordered world. Tomorrow would bring the final revelation, but today had provided all the confirmation she required. The delicate experiment had succeeded, though whether she would survive to share its results remained an open question as 4 guilty women contemplated their narrowing options in the peaceful churchyard where their victim now lay buried. The silence stretched between them like a funeral shroud, each woman measuring the distance to safety, while Miss Pembroke stood with the patient authority of someone who had spent decades watching truth emerge from carefully constructed lies. The morning light fell across the memorial stone with deceptive serenity, illuminating carved names of the peacefully departed, while the living contemplated their own moral mortality. "There is no evidence buried here," Miss Pembroke said gently, her walking stick tracing thoughtful patterns in the soft earth. "Constable Park is attending to other duties entirely. This gathering exists solely to confirm what has become undeniable truth." She turned first to Doctor Vale, whose left hand remained carefully gloved despite the morning's warmth. The handwriting on both messages, 11:55, behind the willow and 9:30, vestry, bears the unmistakable characteristics of medical training. High crossbars on the letter T, peculiarly looped R's, and those telltale gaps between strokes where precision has been emphasized over flow. Your attempt at disguise was admirable, Doctor, but habits formed through years of chart notation are remarkably persistent. Dr. Vale's professional composure cracked like ice in spring. "I only wrote the notes. The rest was we never intended." "Of course not," Miss Pembroke agreed with devastating gentleness. "You intended merely to arrange meetings, to reason with a man whose reforms threatened your community. But intentions have their own momentum, don't they?" She moved to Mrs. Fenn, whose usual confidence had dissolved entirely. "The blue ribbon that appears throughout our village like a signature of conspiracy. You purchased it Tuesday morning, along with brass polish and lavender oil. Not for festival preparations, as you claimed, but for something far more sinister. The ribbon bound the account papers at your pub, but it also bound the ceremonial snuffer to its wooden handle, creating an improvised weapon that could deliver fatal force while protecting the wielder from the beacon's heat." Mrs. Fenn's tears flowed freely now. "He was going to destroy everything. My lease, Tom's livelihood, the way we've always managed things. We only wanted him to understand what his changes would do to people's lives." "Yet you prepared the means for violence," Miss Pembroke observed without accusation. The lavender oil served dual purposes, masking the scent of heated brass and polish, while later being planted in the victim's hand to suggest different associations entirely. Sarah Lytton stepped forward with rigid dignity, accepting the inevitable. "I had access to the church, to the ceremonial snuffer. I knew where it hung, understood its weight and potential. When reasoning failed and Giles threatened to summon Constable Park immediately, when he called our careful stewardship of parish funds embezzlement and fraud," her voice broke, "I struck the blow. The others were horrified, but I couldn't bear watching him destroy everything we'd built." Miss Pembroke nodded with profound sadness. The heated snuffer, attached to its wooden handle with blue sealing wax, delivered the fatal blow during the beacon lighting, when all eyes were turned to flame. The crescent-shaped burn on your palm, Sarah, matches perfectly the curved edge of the brass implement. You alone possessed both the access and the resolve. She turned finally to Lydia, whose widow's composure showed hairline fractures. "And you, Mrs. Weatherby, provided the most crucial element, intimate knowledge of your husband's habits and vulnerabilities. You knew he would respond to mysterious summons, that he found dramatic secret meetings irresistible. You also possessed the church key that allowed access for the vestry fire, designed to destroy evidence and create new alibis." Lydia's careful control shattered completely. "I never wanted him dead. None of us did. We thought if we could just make him understand, show him united opposition to his changes, perhaps detain him until morning brought calmer consideration. But plans have their own terrible momentum," Miss Pembroke continued with gentle inexorability. "The tragedy deepens when we consider this." She produced the misdirected telegram, its timestamp clearly visible. Arrived at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Darlow contract cancelled. Alternative arrangements unnecessary. GW. Your husband had already reversed his most contentious decisions, already secured Tom's position, already arranged charitable provisions for village families. The revelation struck like a physical blow. 4 women stood among the graves, realizing their carefully coordinated conspiracy had been not only morally inexcusable but practically pointless. They had murdered a man who had become the very person they wished him to be. The vestry fire was your attempt to destroy remaining evidence, Miss Pembroke observed. The missing accounts that might reveal Sarah's compassionate but irregular bookkeeping, the convenient elimination of the murder weapon, the creation of new alibis, all orchestrated to protect a conspiracy whose original purpose had been resolved before the crime was even committed. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the churchyard where 4 women confronted the devastating irony of their actions. Each had contributed elements to the murder: notes, materials, access, knowledge, believing they protected their community while actually destroying it. This was not a single act of passion, Miss Pembroke stated with quiet authority. This was coordinated effort, born of fear and misguided loyalty. Each of you played a part, believing your actions justified, believing you were preserving Ashcombe in the Wold's traditions. Instead, you extinguished a life that had already chosen to protect what you held dear. The truth hung between them like smoke from yesterday's fire, undeniable and inescapable. 4 women who had convinced themselves they were community guardians had instead become its destroyers, their careful coordination revealing not strength, but the dangerous power of collective self-deception. Inspector Hale stepped forward with grim understanding, the pieces finally clicking into horrifying precision. The pattern was revealed at last. Not one killer, but a conspiracy of good intentions twisted into something far more sinister than simple murder. Inspector Hale stepped forward from behind the memorial stone with the measured authority of someone whose investigation had finally achieved terrible clarity. The morning light caught his steel-rimmed spectacles as he surveyed the 4 women whose confessions had just sealed their fates with devastating finality. "Ladies," he said with formal gravity, removing his notebook with deliberate precision, "you are under arrest for the murder of Giles Weatherby and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this quiet churchyard. Sarah Lytton straightened with the rigid dignity of someone accepting inevitable consequences, her administrative composure intact even as her world crumbled. Mrs. Fenn collapsed onto a weathered bench, her tears flowing with the abandon of someone whose carefully constructed respectability had finally shattered. Dr. Vale moved instinctively toward Lydia, medical training overriding personal peril, though her hands trembled as she offered what comfort remained possible. Constable Park emerged from the church porch with additional officers summoned from the county station, their presence transforming the peaceful memorial garden into something resembling a crime scene. The careful choreography of arrest and caution proceeded with bureaucratic precision, each woman's rights recited with the same mechanical thoroughness that had characterized their original conspiracy. As the police vehicles departed, carrying their burden of guilt toward county justice, Miss Pembroke remained among the graves, her walking stick planted firmly in earth that had finally yielded its secrets. The village beyond the yew trees continued its morning routines, shopkeepers opening for business, children walking to school, unaware that their community had been forever altered by the morning's revelations. Tom Alder's release came with the apologetic efficiency that accompanies official error. He emerged from county custody with the hollow expression of someone who had spent days contemplating a future that would never arrive, only to discover that his supposed salvation had cost far more than his original predicament. When Constable Park pressed the misdirected telegram into his weathered hands, Tom stared at its message of security with the bewilderment of someone confronting cosmic irony. "They did it for me," he whispered to Miss Pembroke, as they walked slowly toward the village centre. 4 good women destroyed their lives to save a job I would have kept anyway. How does a man live with such knowledge? Miss Pembroke offered no easy consolation for such profound moral complexity. The weight of unintended consequences pressed heavily upon the entire village, transforming familiar streets into landscapes of guilt and regret. The Hare and Willow stood empty, its windows reflecting nothing but sky, while the church vestry bore scorched testimony to desperate attempts at concealment. The news spread through Ashcombe in the Wold with the speed of wildfire, initial shock giving way to a bewildering mixture of outrage, disbelief, and profound betrayal. Neighbours who had whispered support for doing something about Giles now confronted the reality that their casual words had contributed to an atmosphere where murder seemed justified. The comfortable illusion of their village as a peaceful haven was shattered, replaced by the chilling awareness that ordinary people could convince themselves that extraordinary measures were reasonable. The legal proceedings that followed moved with inexorable institutional precision. Sarah Lytton, as the one who struck the fatal blow, faced the gravest charges, though her defence emphasised the unpremeditated nature of the act and her decades of selfless service. Mrs. Fenn's role in providing materials earned her a lesser sentence, tempered by testimony about her genuine horror at the evening's outcome. Dr. Vale's medical standing provided some protection, though her professional ethics board would conduct its own harsh reckoning. Lydia Weatherby's case proved most complex, her position as both widow and conspirator, creating legal tangles that would occupy solicitors for months. The revelation that her husband had already reversed his most controversial decisions cast her actions in an even more tragic light. A woman who had helped orchestrate her husband's death to prevent changes he had already abandoned. Reverend Lytton aged visibly in the weeks following his sister's arrest, his sermons taking on themes of forgiveness and redemption that seemed to address his own anguish as much as his congregation's spiritual needs. The church accounts, destroyed in the vestry fire, were reconstructed through painstaking effort, revealing the compassionate flexibility that Sarah had exercised, irregular perhaps, but motivated by genuine care for those in need. The blue ribbon that had bound their conspiracy together was carefully collected as evidence, though fragments continued to appear in unexpected places, caught on hedgerows, pressed between prayer book pages, tangled in garden roses, like persistent reminders of how good intentions could become instruments of destruction. The village itself struggled with the aftermath of collective guilt. The festival committee disbanded, unable to imagine celebrating anything in a place where community spirit had been so catastrophically corrupted. Suspicion, once directed outward, turned inward, poisoning neighbourly relations and transforming daily routines into tense dances of avoidance and strained politeness. As autumn approached and legal proceedings continued their measured course, Ashcombe in the Wold began the slow process of moral reconstruction. The memorial stone where truth had finally emerged bore fresh flowers each week, placed by anonymous hands seeking some form of redemption for their complicity in the atmosphere that had made murder seem reasonable. Miss Pembroke walked her familiar routes with heavier steps. Her understanding of human nature deepened by witnessing how ordinary people could convince themselves that removing one troublesome individual would restore their carefully ordered world. The pattern she had unravelled revealed not individual evil, but collective self-deception, a community that had talked itself into believing that extraordinary measures were justified by noble intentions. Justice had been served, but its taste was bitter with the knowledge that 4 good women had destroyed themselves, trying to preserve something that had never been truly threatened. The village would survive, as villages do, but it would never again possess the innocent certainty that had made such tragedy possible. Winter settled over Ashcombe in the Wold with unusual gentleness, as if the season understood that the village had already endured sufficient harshness. Miss Pembroke sat in her familiar chair by the sitting-room window, her knitting needles moving with meditative rhythm, while she contemplated the transformed landscape beyond her garden gate. Snow had softened the harsh edges of recent tragedy, but beneath its pristine surface lay the permanent alterations that murder brings to any community. The trials had concluded with sentences that satisfied legal requirements while providing comfort to no one. Sarah Lytton served her time with methodical dignity, her letters filled with regret but never self-pity. Mrs. Fenn's pub had been sold to strangers who complained of persistent lavender scents that no amount of scrubbing could eliminate. Dr. Vale had lost her license, accepting clerical work in a distant county where her medical knowledge could serve without authority to heal. Lydia Weatherby had moved to London, leaving only forwarded addresses and hollow echoes of what might have been. Miss Pembroke reflected on the peculiar nature of this case, so different from dramatic revelations that filled detective novels. No single villain had emerged, no master criminal whose capture restored moral order. Instead, she had uncovered something far more disturbing, the capacity of ordinary people to convince themselves that extraordinary measures were justified by noble intentions. The blue ribbon that had bound their conspiracy together served as metaphor for threads connecting all human communities. The same impulses that created fellowship could, under pressure, transform into something sinister. 4 women who genuinely cared for their neighbours had allowed that care to justify actions that ultimately destroyed everything they claimed to protect. Tom Alder had returned to his duties with hollow efficiency, the knowledge that friends had committed murder to preserve his livelihood, weighing more heavily than unemployment ever could. The church bore its scars with ecclesiastical patience, its rebuilt vestry efficient but unable to recapture centuries of patina. Reverend Lytton conducted services with renewed emphasis on forgiveness, though his congregation had dwindled to souls brave enough to confront their own complicity. The village itself felt the weight of revelation. Easy camaraderie had vanished, replaced by cautious politeness. Neighbours exchanged glances, holding unspoken questions, memories of hurried whispers and shared suspicions. The harvest festival had been subdued, usual boisterousness replaced by quiet solemnity. Miss Pembroke understood that her role in exposing truth had been necessary but unwelcome. Villages preferred mysteries to remain mysterious, dark secrets buried beneath comfortable assumptions. By forcing the community to confront reality, she had performed a service few would thank her for. The pattern she had unravelled revealed uncomfortable truths extending far beyond Ashcombe in the Wold. Communities everywhere harboured the same potential for collective self-deception, the same capacity to transform noble impulses into destructive actions when fear and pressure aligned with opportunity. The conspiracy could bind together similar plots anywhere people convinced themselves that removing one troublesome individual would restore their carefully ordered world. She had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most virtuous, who understood that the best hiding place was behind facades of community service and moral authority. Sarah's church work, Mrs. Fenn's hospitality, Doctor. Vale's medical dedication, Lydia's position as grieving widow, all had provided perfect camouflage for coordinated murder. The investigation revealed tragic irony that often accompanies human action. The telegram that might have prevented the entire conspiracy had arrived in time, but communication failures kept it from reaching those who needed its information most desperately. Good intentions, poor coordination, and fear's momentum had combined to create tragedy, serving no purpose and satisfying no genuine need. As spring approached, Miss Pembroke observed the slow process of moral reconstruction. New families moved into empty cottages, bringing fresh perspectives unburdened by recent events. Children played where the beacon had witnessed murder, their laughter gradually replacing echoes of that terrible night. Yet beneath surface healing, she detected permanent changes tragedy brings to any community. Conversations carried new undercurrents of caution, neighbourly relations bore subtle strain of shared guilt, and comfortable certainty was replaced by awareness that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary evil when circumstances aligned with fear. Truth had been served, justice administered, and life continued its inexorable progress. But the village would never again possess the innocent certainty that had made such tragedy possible. Perhaps, Miss Pembroke reflected, that loss of innocence was itself wisdom, bitter, but necessary for genuine understanding of what human beings were capable of when they convinced themselves that good intentions justified any means necessary to achieve them. The blue ribbon was gone, scattered by wind and weather, but its symbolic presence lingered as a reminder that human nature remained both the most fascinating and most dangerous force in any community.